Welcome to episode 6 of Weekend Extra Edition. This is the podcast where I talk about my 2 decades spent in an off-the-grid religious cult that was apocalyptic in nature. And I discuss the effects of that experience, both the positive and the negative. There were both. So, here it is. As you listen, please consider subscribing to my channel and becoming a part of the conversation that I hope this turns into. Any support means a lot to me. Your watch time, I understand that you're giving a part of your life to watching what I say. I deeply appreciate that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So, with that, let's get into it. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Last week, in part 1, I covered repentance, and there's a couple of critical things that I missed when I did that. Repentance, just to briefly recap so it's in your minds, is the process of righting a wrong that exists between you and a person, between you and God, or you and creation, or some combination of all those. And that process is owning and acknowledging that you have a problem, expanding on the effects of that problem, apologizing for it, creating a change, and in the process of feeling forgiven. And like many, many things in my cult experience, that had some positive effects. And it had some really, really negative effects as well. On the surface, it seems like a very good thing, and many visitors to community were shocked at how positive and how good things were. That was the public face of community, and that was the community's successes, where people's insecurities and fears and paranoias, their need for power or their need for some kind of dominance or to be right, or their need for spiritual validation, when those kind of dynamics came into play, it got very ugly and very damaging. I sat through meetings where people were reproved or called to repentance, in which they were so utterly humiliated, so utterly frustrated, so utterly beaten down that they were weeping. Grown men, strong men, men that I respect to this day, were destroyed. Because in the midst of that process of being reproved or called to repentance, or repentance process, you couldn't just say, that's not a thing, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. You had to accept what was being said pretty much at face value. The person who is reproving you would have supposedly sought the Spirit of God prior to that conversation, and would have supposedly received light or inspiration from God prior to that conversation. So when the person came and talked to you, it wasn't necessarily thought of as a finished product, but it was almost always presented as a finished product. And to disagree with that was called dishonoring repentance, and that was punishable by penance days, which I've spoken about earlier, where you confessed your sin, and in some instances you would put a quarter of your food back during meal times. You were seated in a certain place when you were on days, which was called holy, wasn't necessarily viewed that way. You were cut off from participating in most decisions and decision-making processes, most holidays or holy days, and participating in events of religious significance, which was kind of a big deal. That was kind of the goal. It was, in a sense, going to Christmas and watching all the other kids open presents. Because to partake in those holy days meant that you were succeeding with God and you were achieving what you needed to achieve. So if you deflected attention away from yourself when you were being reproved, so someone said, hey, you weren't hearing God the other day when you spoke at church, you couldn't say, well, yes, but also this other person didn't hear God, or you couldn't say, no, that's not the case. I was hearing God. You're full of hooey. Most of the time, you simply had to accept it at face value. Here's something really interesting that doesn't mean much, but I'm going to say it anyway. Hooey was a community word for shit. I have a tendency to talk like I'm in community when I talk about community. That's really weird. I'm sure there's some very fascinating psychology behind it, but not a psychologist. So this concept of repentance, you pretty much had to take it on the chin and deal with it the best you could. Now, in a low-key interpersonal environment, that could bring two people close together. It could be very, very constructive in a relationship. It could enhance and build a friendship. You could end up feeling loved if that person was intelligent and tactful and supportive in the way that they reproved you. That was fairly frequent. But what stands out, and where the problem came for me and for many, many others, was the fact that reproval was also used for keeping people in their place, kind of. Political gain, kind of. For quieting the voice of people who would dissent. It became a mechanism of control and discussion and a way of marginalizing people who had a different view. If not dissent, then simply a different interpretation of something. So that would come about in a public setting. And once again, that was also used to confront a person, because then they had social pressure. If a person was doing something that was being disagreed with by leadership, and I don't say my uncle because he's not exclusively responsible for this, I was involved in this. You would reprove them in a more public forum, and then that social pressure would be such that they would be inclined to agree with you or forced to acquiesce. But then there was a lot of shame involved in that. There was a loss of personal dignity. There was the knowledge that you were being pushed to do something or to admit something that wasn't necessarily true, or controlled in some way, and you couldn't do anything about it. That was very difficult. As I said earlier, I watched a lot of people just break down under that pressure, because it could be brutal. It could be very brutal. all in the name of serving God. So a person who wasn't, and this, I used an example of kicking a dog, I think either in the last episode or in a previous episode, I don't remember which one. Kicking dogs isn't a sin that happened with great frequency. I'm sure someone at some point in the history of community kicked a dog. I can't recollect a specific example, but that was just kind of a throwaway example. Most of the time, when someone called somebody to repentance, it was over not hearing the Spirit, or bringing a negative spirit, or something that was very, very nuanced and subjective. So fighting that, or if you felt differently about the situation, bringing a different perspective of the person who was reproving you, was very thin ice, because all of it was open to interpretation. All of it was very subtle, and that was the bulk, I would say, of most reprovals. Had, if they weren't out and out entirely subjective and entirely nuanced, then there was that element behind it all of something that could be interpreted multiple ways, that was being interpreted a certain way. So I would say most of the time people didn't just stand up and scream curse words in the middle of church. It was they said something that people didn't agree with, or they brought a perspective that leadership felt needed to be quashed. And then it was quashed, and all that nuance and subjectivity was brought to bear on that person. So it was, I don't know how to explain it very well to someone who has no experience with it. It's and I hate cliches, but here it is. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have the ability to bring people together in a very incredible way and resolve things. And when it was appropriate and used appropriately and with respect and with dignity and with valuing the other person, like I said, it could build friendships. On the other hand, when it was used as a mechanism for power plays or politics, or to quash a view, it could be incredibly destructive. I watched my parents get dragged in front of the whole entire congregation dozens, if not hundreds of times in my upbringing, which was really, really hard for me. I think I still have those lingering effects, and I don't communicate with my parents quite like I need to, or even at all like I need to, if I'm honest. Because that interchange in public led to a distrust of them. So I allowed myself to begin viewing them with distrust. They don't speak with the Spirit. They don't have God's best interest on the forefront of their mind. And so I began to distrust them as well as other people, and that was frequent. Those kinds of public, very subjective reprovals were frequent. Those kinds of things, that kind of distrust, that kind of intensity, came into a lot of marriages. I've spoken before about family units and how those were broken. That whole calling people to repentance and the enormous pressure to simply accept and to roll with it got in between marriages, not just parents and children, but also spouses. And another facet of that repentance is the higher up you were in spiritual authority, the more weight was typically given to you. So if you were reproved by someone who was currently a pariah, you could probably finesse your way out of it. If you were reproved by someone with high inscription, or someone who had spiritual significance, you were in the upper echelon of the hierarchy, it was over. So a lot of attention is brought to my uncle in that, and I think justly, for the most part, since he was first inscribed and at the head of the hierarchy. So his word, it wasn't unquestionable per se, and certainly that was never acknowledged, but in practical terms, really wasn't questionable. Not to any effective degree. So I neglected to speak about that last week because I forgot about it entirely. And that's a frequent thing of mine, is forgetting specifics. My mother has an exceptional memory for all these things. She keeps me on track. A shout out to her. She has been very supportive in all this. So with that, I think I'll wrap up the repentance thing. If there's any questions, as always, ask them. There's no bad questions. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to answer every question, because some things I'm not ready to process, and some things I feel aren't mine to share. But ask them anyway, and we'll work it out later. Moving on to the second foundation of community. What are we looking at for time here? Ah, shit. I'll briefly introduce righteousness before moving on. My view of the definition of word righteous is probably not yours. When most people hear righteous, they think of upright and pure and virtuous and pious, those sorts of things. For me, just because of how many years I was steeped in using righteous to mean something very different, I don't really think of it that way. Righteousness, in a nutshell, is sensing and immersing oneself in the Christ Spirit in one's environment, and having things in one's environment that bring that Christ Spirit closer. And I think I'm going to go ahead and pause there, and I'll be right back. So righteousness, the pursuit of the Christ Spirit. In the theology of community, God created all things with the intent that he would have assets, meaning creation, that would steer a person towards what was called your vision of creative purpose, or, and this was different for everybody, some very aggrandized, very ideal goal for a person, for their life. So some people would be, say, their vision of creative purpose was to bring the voice of discernment, or the voice of truth, and that is what God had in mind when he created that person. So that's why all creation was created. That it gets very, very complicated, and that's probably a topic for another time, but if we can just accept that every person has a unique vision, or an object for which they were created, an objective for which they were created, then we can proceed. Creation had some that agreed to do that, some that did not agree to do that. There were good and bad angels. God dang it. The good angels are natural things, and the bad angels are things that kind of have to dig for by and large. Good angels are things like mountains and oceans and rivers and hills and wind and the sun and clouds and stars and those kinds of things. And the bad angels are like iron in some cases. I'll explain more on that later if I remember. And like sulfur and copper, the law of man, the writing on tombs, electricity, petroleum products, lead, various other things like that, which is the dig part. Man-made things, kind of. The Strong's Biblical Concordance was probably one of the most frequently used books in Community because it has a section of Hebrew words and roots and so on in the back. And Hebrew was considered to be the language that God spoke to humans in. He could speak to everybody, but Hebrew was kind of like the language that he created, I guess. So the word for the good angels was Ir Kodeshi. The word for the bad angels is Dekadarchi. And if anybody who speaks Hebrew ever listens to this, if you laugh your ass off, then you laugh your ass off. I'm sure I'm butchering how both of those things are said, but essentially that means good angels and bad angels. The holy watchers and the fallen watchers, if you will, which were terms used by Community. So every specific thing in creation had its own unique contribution to a person. I understand how wacky this sounds, but this is the theology. So, for example, an oak tree was created, all oak trees were created with the ability to bring a spirit of strength to a person. Not physical strength, but a spiritual strength. The religion is very anthropocentric. I believe I'm saying that right. Centered on man. Man is the object of creation. Man is why everything was made. Man is the pinnacle of all the handiwork of God. So that oak tree, its wood could be carried with a person, or burned, or you could speak to a tree to gain those feelings of strength. Now, in speaking to a tree, I literally mean that you're essentially praying to it, but because, and this is probably a topic for another time, we can get into this. Community wouldn't have considered it praying to the tree because you can only pray to God, and all pagan rituals are sorcery and witchcraft. So you're praying to a tree while not calling it praying to a tree. But those things give you the feeling of spiritual strength, which can help you to accomplish whatever you need to accomplish in your life. So there's countless different, they're called definitions. The strength part of the oak tree is the definition of the oak tree. It was created to bring strength. Those definitions are the reasons why things are created. There's hundreds, if not thousands of them that have been identified through the voice of God in Community. But also, on the bad angel side, the fallen watcher side, one needs to be aware of those things because those will try to lure you away from your vision and created purpose, or that ideal that God set for you when He created you. So righteousness is surrounding yourself and living in, immersing yourself in, and appropriately using all those different definitions in your life to propel yourself towards that object that God laid out, to that objective that God laid out for you at the beginning of time. That resulted in a lifestyle that very primitive. God, I hope that might okay. I didn't know if my microphone was on. It was off for a while, and I recorded a bunch without saying anything. It was just me moving around. That resulted in a very simplistic, basic lifestyle, very labor intensive, but there were very definitely rewards to that. Understanding the value of your labor, seeing yourself create something by hand was very rewarding. You wouldn't have used electricity or petroleum to generate it in most cases, even though they did use that, but it was for a righteous purpose, so it was justified. Which will bring me back to steel and iron. As I said earlier, in some cases it's a fallen watcher, in some cases it's a holy watcher. It depends on the purpose that it's used for. That doesn't apply to all the fallen watchers, but it applies to steel and something else. I don't remember what the other one is, and at the moment, I don't really care. But it was kind of a fence sitter angel, I guess, for lack of better words. But you would produce everything by dint of sheer labor. So if you needed a pair of mittens, you'd have to shear the sheep, process the wool, make it into yarn, and knit it. By the time they're on your hands, there's probably dozens of man hours of labor involved in that. And there's something very rewarding and very connecting about that. You don't take things as for granted as you would if you just go down to the store and buy yourself a pair of mittens. There's very definitely a disconnect from the value of your labor. And that was one of the good things about that lifestyle. Throughout this, I'm not just going to shit all over community because I had a bad experience. There were very definitely some positive things. Repentance could bring the positivity of friendship and a greater connection to a person. Righteousness brought a greater connection to your environment and really brought home the value of your labor. I would guess that the average community member's carbon footprint is significantly less than mine is right now, which is valuable. So there's positives and negatives to both sides. The negatives to me are more obvious, more long-lasting, more insidious than the positives. I feel like the positives of my life now outweigh the negatives in such a dramatic fashion that I don't even know how to compare the two lives, because it's like I've literally had two lives. It's a very weird feeling. I mentioned culture shock earlier, and I still deal with that every day. But yeah, that's righteousness in a nutshell. I'm sure next week I'll come back and touch on some more things. But it was mostly living with an awareness of that Christ Spirit and a unity with that Christ Spirit, an appropriate usage of that Christ Spirit in all these very specific ways in the environment. I welcome your questions on this. It's very, very hard because I haven't experienced something else. It's very hard for me to explain it to someone who doesn't know what I'm talking about. So any questions, any comments, any perspective that anyone has is welcome. And I think that that's going to wrap up the second part of the law. There's noise in the background. We're living life here. It happens. So, there you go. You're a part of the family now. Next week, I'll talk at least about common consent, if not all things common, the last two of the four foundations. Because I don't think that those topics just themselves would merit a full show unless I get into it and and discover otherwise. But that's for next week. Join me then, and we'll see how far we get. I had an excellent week on YouTube. My channel had an excellent week last week because people shared and people commented and people watched. And I want you all to know that I really appreciate that. As I mentioned earlier, I understand that you're taking a part of your life and giving it to me to listen to me drone on about something that's very strange. I really appreciate it. If you would continue to do that, I'll be in your debt. Please feel free to engage with me either here or on social media. Links are always below. Thank you for being a part of this. The response was, frankly, a little overwhelming and a little terrifying. I mentioned, I believe earlier, that I am afraid of reprisals from community. That still might happen. It is what it is. Because I was a part of it, this story belongs to me, and that's what we're here doing, sharing the story. At any rate, I appreciate it. Thank you for sticking with me. If you're just joining, welcome to the Madhouse. We're doing this thing. We're going to do it next week. And for now, I'm done. Thank you.